If someone had told me that the happiest day of my life would become the most painful memory I would ever carry, I would have laughed. Not because I believed life was perfect, but because I believed in us. My name is Emma, and for 6 years, Ryan wasn't just the man I loved. He was my best friend, my biggest supporter, and the person I imagined growing old with. Every dream I had about the future included him. Every plan, every holiday, every little conversation about where we wanted to live or how many children we hoped to have, it all began with the word we. Looking back now, I realize how innocent that version of me was. I met Ryan on a rainy October afternoon at a neighborhood bookstore in Boston. I had ducked inside to escape the weather after leaving work, carrying nothing but a cup of coffee and a long list of books I wanted to read. As I reached for a novel on the top shelf, another hand reached for it at exactly the same moment. "Oh, sorry," I said, laughing as I stepped back. "You saw it first," he replied with a warm smile. "But now I have to know if it's actually worth reading." That simple conversation lasted nearly an hour. We talked about books, music, travel, childhood memories, and the places we hoped to visit one day. It felt strangely effortless, as though we'd known each other much longer than 60 minutes. Before I left, he scribbled his number on the back of my bookstore receipt. "In case you ever want to argue about books again." I smiled all the way home. That receipt stayed tucked inside my favorite novel for years. Our first date wasn't expensive or extravagant. Ryan took me to a small diner overlooking the harbor. We shared burgers, laughed until the waitress joked that we were keeping the restaurant open by ourselves, and walked along the waterfront until midnight. There were no fireworks. No dramatic movie moments. Just two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Sometimes the strongest love stories don't begin with grand gestures. They begin with comfort. Ryan had a way of making ordinary moments feel unforgettable. He remembered small details about me. He knew I hated mushrooms but loved extra pickles on my burgers. He always carried an umbrella because he knew I never checked the weather. Whenever I worked late, he'd leave dinner in the refrigerator with little handwritten notes that simply said, "Eat before you fall asleep." Those tiny acts of kindness meant more to me than expensive gifts ever could. 2 years into our relationship, my father suffered a heart attack. It happened without warning. One phone call changed everything. I was terrified. For 3 days, Ryan barely left the hospital. He brought coffee for my exhausted mother. He stayed beside me through every doctor's update. When I finally broke down crying in the hallway, he wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "You don't have to carry this alone." That moment changed something inside me. Love wasn't about flowers. It wasn't about romantic vacations. It was about showing up when life became difficult. Ryan always showed up. Or at least, that's what I believed. 3 years later, after my father had fully recovered, Ryan proposed during a quiet weekend trip to a small lakeside cabin we loved visiting every autumn. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't dramatic. He simply took my hands and smiled. "I don't want a perfect life," he said. "I just want a life where I get to face every imperfect day with you." Before he even opened the ring box, I already knew my answer. Yes. I don't think I've ever been happier than I was in that moment. Planning our wedding became one of the most exciting chapters of our lives. Every evening after work, we'd sit at the kitchen table surrounded by magazines, guest lists, color samples, and notebooks filled with ideas. Ryan had surprisingly strong opinions about everything. Especially the food. If we're paying for dinner, he'd laugh, "People are getting real dessert." I teased him endlessly about being more excited for the wedding cake than the wedding itself. He always smiled and replied, "Both are equally important." Those conversations became some of my favorite memories. We weren't planning a luxury wedding. We wanted something elegant, warm, and personal. A place where our families and closest friends could celebrate with us. As the months passed, everything slowly came together. The venue overlooked a beautiful lake surrounded by tall oak trees. The flowers were simple white roses mixed with eucalyptus. The invitations were mailed. The photographer was booked. The honeymoon tickets rested safely inside my desk drawer. Every little detail reminded me that we were only weeks away from beginning the next chapter of our lives. Our families couldn't have been happier. My mother adored Ryan. She often joked that she was gaining the son she never had. Ryan's parents welcomed me as though I had already been part of their family for years. Whenever we all gathered for Sunday dinners, laughter filled the room. Everything felt right. Friends often told us we were the couple everyone admired. "You two make marriage look easy," my coworker Lily once said. I smiled. We're lucky. Maybe we were. Or maybe we simply hadn't reached the chapter where life would test us. As the wedding day approached, Ryan became busier with work. He apologized often. Just a few more projects, he'd tell me. After the wedding, things will finally slow down. I believed him. There were moments when he seemed distracted, staring into space as though something weighed heavily on his mind. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he'd force a smile. "I'm just tired." It wasn't unusual. Planning a wedding while balancing demanding careers exhausted both of us. I never imagined there could be another explanation. The night before the wedding, tradition kept us apart. I stayed at my parents' house while Ryan spent the evening with his best man. Before going to bed, my phone buzzed. A message from Ryan. "I can't wait to see you tomorrow. I love you more than words can say." I smiled as I read it again. Then again. I replied almost immediately. "Tomorrow, I marry my best friend." He responded with a heart emoji. That was the last message I would ever receive from him before everything changed. The next morning felt like a dream. Bridesmaids filled the bridal suite with laughter. Hairstylists hurried from chair to chair. Someone accidentally spilled champagne on the floor, and everyone laughed. My mother helped button the back of my wedding dress. When she saw me standing in front of the mirror, tears filled her eyes. "You look beautiful." I hugged her tightly. "I'm nervous." "That's normal." "No." I smiled. "I'm excited." Outside, guests were already arriving. The music had begun. I could hear voices drifting through the open windows. Everything we had planned for over a year was finally happening. My father knocked gently on the bridal suite door. "It's time." He offered me his arm. As we walked toward the ceremony, I felt my heart racing. Not from fear. From happiness. The doors slowly opened. Every guest stood. Beautiful music filled the air. I stepped into the aisle, holding my father's arm, searching for Ryan's familiar smile waiting at the altar. But the altar was empty. The officiant looked confused. The guests began whispering. Ryan's best man stood frozen, staring toward the entrance behind him. I looked around, certain there had been some kind of mistake. "Where's Ryan?" I whispered. No one answered. Then I saw Ryan's mother covering her mouth as tears rolled down her face. His father pulled out his phone with trembling hands. The wedding coordinator rushed past us, panic written across her face. Minutes felt like hours. The whispers grew louder. Confusion slowly turned into concern. Then concern became something far worse. Ryan wasn't running late. Ryan was gone. And as I stood there in my wedding dress, surrounded by everyone we loved, I realized the man who had promised to spend forever with me had disappeared without a single explanation, leaving me alone at the altar in front of every person who had come to witness the happiest day of our lives. The silence inside the wedding venue lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. At first, everyone assumed there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe Ryan had been delayed by traffic. Maybe he was feeling sick. Maybe there had been a problem with his car. People whispered to each other, trying to find a reasonable explanation. I stood at the end of the aisle, still holding my father's arm, unable to understand why the man who had promised to marry me just hours earlier wasn't standing at the altar. The wedding coordinator hurried toward Ryan's best man. "Can you reach him?" she asked nervously. "I'm trying." He dialed Ryan's number again. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Ryan's parents looked just as confused as everyone else. His mother kept saying, "This isn't like him." His father repeatedly checked his phone, hoping for a message that never came. The guests began looking at me with sympathy. That look hurt more than I could describe. I didn't want their pity. I wanted my fiancé. After nearly 30 minutes of waiting, the officiant quietly approached me. "I'm so sorry." Those words made everything feel real. I slowly looked around the room. The flowers we had carefully chosen. The candles. The chairs filled with family and friends. The wedding music still playing softly in the background. Everything we had spent months planning had become meaningless in a matter of minutes. I felt my knees weaken. My father immediately wrapped his arm around me before I could fall. "We're going home," he whispered. I shook my head. "No. Emma. I need to know where he is." But no one had any answers. The reception was cancelled. Guests quietly left the venue, avoiding eye contact because they didn't know what to say. Some hugged me. Some cried. Others simply walked away in silence. The photographers packed their cameras without taking a single wedding photograph. The wedding cake remained untouched. The dance floor stayed empty. Every dream I had imagined disappeared before my eyes. Back at my parents' house, I still refused to remove my wedding dress. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. Every vibration made my heart race. Every notification filled me with hope. But none of them were from Ryan. Friends texted. Family called. Coworkers sent messages asking if I was okay. The one person I needed to hear from remained completely silent. Around midnight, I finally called him again. Straight to voicemail. I left a message. "Ryan, please. If something happened, if you're hurt, if you're scared, just tell me you're alive. I don't care about anything else." My voice broke. "Please call me." He never did. The next morning, social media was already filled with speculation. People had seen wedding guests leaving early. Someone had posted pictures of the empty ceremony. Rumors spread faster than the truth ever could. Some people claimed Ryan had changed his mind. Others said I must have done something terrible. A few insisted they had always known our relationship wasn't as perfect as it looked. It amazed me how quickly strangers became experts on a life they knew nothing about. I stopped reading the comments after the first hour. Every sentence felt like another wound. Over the next few days, Ryan completely disappeared. His apartment was empty. His office said he had taken an unexpected leave of absence. Even his closest friends couldn't reach him. Or at least, that's what they claimed. Part of me wondered whether someone was protecting him. Another part didn't even care anymore. I only wanted one answer. Why? 1 week later, I finally gathered the strength to return to the apartment we had shared. Walking through the front door felt unbearable. His shoes were still beside the entrance. His favorite coffee mug sat in the sink. His jacket still hung in the hallway closet. Everything looked exactly the same. Except he was gone. I slowly walked into our bedroom. My wedding dress still hung inside its protective garment bag. I reached out and touched the fabric before collapsing onto the floor. For the first time since the wedding, I allowed myself to cry without trying to stay strong for everyone else. I cried for the future we had planned. For the children we talked about having. For the home we wanted to buy. For every promise that suddenly meant nothing. Weeks turned into months. People slowly stopped asking questions. Life moved on for everyone except me. Returning to work wasn't easy. Some coworkers didn't know what to say. Others avoided the subject completely. One afternoon, a patient looked at the engagement ring I still wore. "When's the wedding?" The question hit me like a punch. I forced a smile. "It didn't happen." The woman immediately apologized. "It's okay," I whispered. But it wasn't. Not even close. Eventually, I took the ring off. Not because I had stopped loving Ryan. Because wearing it every day felt like holding onto a future that no longer existed. My best friend Lily stayed beside me through everything. One evening, while we were sitting on my balcony watching the sunset, she finally asked the question everyone else was afraid to ask. "What if he never comes back?" I stared at the sky. "I don't know." "What if you never find out why?" That possibility terrified me more than anything. Because pain eventually fades. Questions don't. Months passed. Then a year. There was still no message. No letter. No explanation. Nothing. At some point, people stopped referring to me as the bride who had been left at the altar. Instead, I became the woman whose fiancé disappeared. It became part of my identity. Something I never wanted. Every new relationship people tried to introduce me to ended before it even began. Not because I wasn't ready to date. Because I still carried unanswered questions. How do you trust someone after the person you trusted most vanishes on your wedding day? The years slowly changed me. The heartbreak became quieter. The tears became less frequent. The memories hurt a little less. But one thing never changed. Every October, on the anniversary of the wedding that never happened, I visited the lakeside where Ryan had proposed. Not because I hoped he would be there. Because I needed to remind myself that the love we shared had once been real. Whatever happened afterward couldn't erase that. 3 years passed. By then, I had accepted something I once believed was impossible. I might never know why Ryan left. I had stopped searching. Stopped waiting. Stopped hoping. I finally convinced myself that some questions simply don't have answers. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, just as I was leaving the hospital after finishing my shift, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Emma." I froze. My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned around. Standing a few feet away was the man who had disappeared on our wedding day. Ryan looked older. Thinner. The confidence I once admired had been replaced by exhaustion and regret. His eyes met mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, with tears already forming in his eyes, he whispered the words I had waited 3 long years to hear. "Please, just give me 5 minutes. I need you to hear the truth." And in that moment, I realized the mystery that had haunted my life for 3 years was finally about to be uncovered. For 3 years, I imagined what I would do if I ever saw Ryan again. At first, I thought I would scream at him. Then I convinced myself I would demand answers. Later, I decided I would simply walk away without saying a word. But life has a strange way of changing your priorities. The truth was, after 3 years, I had spent far more time rebuilding myself than imagining revenge. The first year after Ryan disappeared was the hardest. Every morning felt like a battle. Getting out of bed required more strength than I thought I had. The apartment we had once shared no longer felt like home. Every room carried a memory. The kitchen reminded me of our late-night dinners. The couch reminded me of movie marathons on rainy weekends. Even the hallway made me think of the mornings he kissed my forehead before leaving for work. Eventually, I realized I wasn't healing because I was surrounded by a life that no longer existed. So I made my first difficult decision. I moved. It wasn't a luxury apartment. It wasn't even bigger than the old one. But it was mine. No memories. No ghosts. No promises hanging on the walls. The first night there felt painfully quiet. I sat on the living room floor eating takeout from a paper container because I hadn't unpacked the kitchen yet. For the first time in months, I wasn't crying. I was simply breathing. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with dramatic breakthroughs. Sometimes it begins with a single peaceful evening. Returning to work became my greatest source of stability. The hospital reminded me that life continued no matter how broken I felt. Children still needed nurses. Families still needed hope. Patients still needed someone willing to sit beside them during frightening moments. Helping other people slowly reminded me that my own life still had purpose. One afternoon, after helping an elderly patient through a difficult recovery, she squeezed my hand before leaving the hospital. "You have a beautiful smile," she said. I almost laughed. If only she knew how long it had been since I believed that myself. Instead, I smiled a little wider. "Thank you." Those two words stayed with me for days. Maybe I hadn't completely disappeared beneath my heartbreak. Maybe parts of the old Emma were still there. I simply needed to find her again. A few months later, my manager called me into her office. "I've been watching your work." My stomach tightened. Had I made a mistake? Instead, she smiled. "We're opening a leadership training program. I'd like you to apply." I stared at her in disbelief. "Me? Yes. I don't think I'm ready." She leaned forward. "Emma. Sometimes the only person who doesn't see your strength is you." I walked out of her office thinking about those words. For years, my confidence had depended on the way Ryan looked at me. When he loved me, I felt beautiful. When he left, I questioned everything about myself. Maybe it was finally time to stop allowing someone else's choices to define my worth. I submitted the application. The program wasn't easy. Long hospital shifts were followed by evening classes. Weekends disappeared beneath textbooks and leadership projects. Many nights I fell asleep with my laptop still open beside me. But every assignment I completed reminded me of something important. I was capable of growing. Not because someone believed in me. Because I believed in myself. Around the same time, Lily convinced me to join her Saturday morning hiking group. "I hate hiking," I complained. "No. You hate waking up early." "That's also true." The first hike nearly defeated me. Halfway up the trail, I was completely out of breath. "I think I'm dying," I joked. Lily laughed. "No. You're just climbing." Her words carried more meaning than she probably realized. Healing often feels exactly like climbing. Painful. Slow. Exhausting. But every step takes you somewhere higher than where you started. The hiking trips became a tradition. Every Saturday, I met people who had no idea about my wedding. No one looked at me with pity. No one whispered behind my back. To them, I was simply Emma. And I had forgotten how wonderful that felt. By the second year, life looked completely different. I earned my leadership certification. Received a promotion. Moved into a brighter apartment closer to the hospital. I even adopted an energetic golden retriever puppy after Lily insisted I needed something that forces you to laugh. She was right. Oliver quickly became the happiest part of my mornings. He greeted every day as though it were the greatest adventure in history. Watching him reminded me that joy often exists in ordinary moments. Slowly, my confidence returned. I started traveling again. Sometimes alone. Sometimes with friends. I visited places Ryan and I had always planned to see together. At first, I worried those trips would make me sad. Instead, they reminded me that my dreams had never belonged to another person. They had always belonged to me. The third year brought opportunities one never imagined. The hospital promoted me to Director of Patient Services. Standing in my new office on my first day, I looked out over the city skyline. 3 years earlier, I thought my life had ended. Now I realized it had simply changed direction. One Friday evening, after finishing work, I attended a charity gala organized by the hospital. As I walked through the ballroom, several colleagues congratulated me on my recent promotion. One doctor smiled and said, "You've become one of the strongest leaders in this hospital." I thanked him politely. But inside, I couldn't help thinking about the woman who once couldn't even walk through a grocery store without crying. She would never have believed this future was possible. On the drive home, I stopped at a red light and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different. Because I carried myself differently. The sadness that once lived permanently in my eyes had been replaced by quiet confidence. I no longer wondered why I wasn't enough. I already knew I was. When I reached home, Oliver greeted me at the door with his usual excitement. I laughed as he nearly knocked me over trying to welcome me inside. "This is becoming a dangerous habit," I told him. He wagged his tail as though completely innocent. After dinner, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset. 3 years earlier, sunsets reminded me of Ryan's proposal by the lake. Now they simply reminded me that every day ends, no matter how difficult it has been. And every morning offers another chance to begin again. My phone buzzed on the small table beside me. It was a message from Lily. "Proud of you. You've come so far." I smiled. She was right. Not because I had become successful. Not because I had forgotten Ryan. But because I had stopped allowing my worst day to define the rest of my life. I had finally built a future that belonged entirely to me. I truly believed the painful chapter of my life was over. I believed Ryan had become nothing more than a memory. I believed the unanswered questions no longer mattered. Then, the following Tuesday afternoon, as I walked out of the hospital carrying my bag over one shoulder, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in exactly 3 years. "Emma." Every muscle in my body froze. Slowly, I turned around. Standing near the hospital entrance was the man who had disappeared from our wedding day without a single explanation. Ryan. He looked older. His shoulders were heavier. The confidence I once admired had disappeared, replaced by regret written across his face. Our eyes met. For a long moment, the entire world seemed to stand still. Then he took one hesitant step toward me. "Please," he whispered. "Just let me explain." And after waiting 3 years for answers, I realized the truth I had once believed would set me free was finally standing right in front of me. For a moment, I simply stared at Ryan. 3 years. 1,095 days. That was how long I had waited for an explanation that I had finally convinced myself I would never receive. Now the man who had disappeared without a word was standing only a few feet away, asking for 5 minutes of my time. Every emotion I thought I had buried suddenly rushed back. The humiliation of standing alone at the altar. The sleepless nights. The unanswered questions. The months spent wondering whether I had done something wrong. Ryan looked nothing like the confident man I had planned to marry. His clothes were neat but simple. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. His shoulders were slumped as though he had been carrying an invisible weight for years. "Emma," he said again. "Please. I know I don't deserve it. But I need you to hear the truth." I looked at my watch. Part of me wanted to walk away. Another part knew that if I left now, I might spend the rest of my life wondering what he had been trying to say. "There's a coffee shop across the street," I finally said. "You have one chance." Relief washed across his face. "Thank you." Neither of us spoke as we walked. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Years of pain filled every step. When we reached the cafe, we chose a quiet table near the window. The waitress came over. "Can I get you anything?" "Black coffee," Ryan said. "Tea," I replied. As soon as she walked away, Ryan folded his hands together. They were shaking. I've practiced this conversation 1,000 times. I just don't know where to begin. Try the beginning, I answered. He nodded slowly. Do you remember 3 weeks before our wedding? I searched my memory. You started working late almost every night. He smiled sadly. Those weren't work meetings. I felt my chest tighten. For a second, I thought I already knew where this was going. You were seeing someone else? He immediately shook his head. No. Never. I never cheated on you. I looked at him carefully. After everything that had happened, believing him wasn't easy. Then what was it? Ryan took a deep breath. My father. I frowned. What about him? He collapsed at work. I stared at him. You told me he had the flu. I lied. Why? His eyes filled with tears. Because the doctors found something. My heartbeat quickened. What? He struggled to say the words. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The air seemed to disappear from the room. I remembered his father looking healthy during our engagement party. Smiling. Laughing. Planning fishing trips with Ryan after the wedding. No. Ryan nodded. The doctors gave him less than a year. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to. So many times. But Dad made me promise. He said he didn't want our wedding to become about his illness. I remained silent. Ryan continued. We started traveling to specialists. Clinical trials. Private consultations. I was driving him across the state 3 or 4 nights a week. I remembered all those late evenings. The canceled dinners. The exhausted look on his face. I had assumed he was simply working. I should have trusted you, he whispered. I know that now. But that's only part of the story. I looked at him. What else happened? Ryan closed his eyes for a moment. The week before the wedding. He told me something. What? Ryan's voice became almost impossible to hear. He wasn't my biological father. I blinked in disbelief. What? My mother confessed everything. There had been an affair before I was born. My dad knew the truth my entire life. But he chose to raise me as his son anyway. I struggled to find words. Ryan. He begged me not to tell anyone. He said he didn't want our families destroyed. He wanted to spend whatever time he had left in peace. The waitress quietly placed our drinks on the table before walking away again. Neither of us touched them. I felt like my entire life had been built on lies. Ryan stared into his coffee. I didn't know who I was anymore. My father was dying. My family was falling apart. I couldn't think. I listened without interrupting. I started having panic attacks. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I kept telling myself things would get better after the wedding. But they didn't. He swallowed hard. 2 days before the ceremony, I had the worst panic attack of my life. I collapsed in my apartment. My doctor told me I was having a complete emotional breakdown. I felt my anger beginning to soften. Not disappear. Just soften. So why didn't you call me? I wanted to. I picked up my phone dozens of times. He pulled out his wallet. From inside, he carefully unfolded a worn piece of paper. I even wrote you this. He handed it to me. The letter was dated the morning of our wedding. The handwriting was shaky. Asterisk Emma, I love you more than you'll ever know. But I'm falling apart, and I'm terrified I'll destroy your life if I pretend everything is okay. You deserve a husband who walks toward you with certainty, not someone who is breaking inside. I know leaving will make you hate me, but right now I believe that's better than making you spend your life carrying my pain. I'm so sorry. Asterisk. Tears blurred the words. You wrote this? He nodded. I was going to leave it with my best man. What happened? I couldn't. I was ashamed. So instead, I ran. The honesty in his voice hurt more than any excuse could have. You should have trusted me. I know. You took away my choice. I know. You humiliated me in front of everyone. His eyes filled with tears. I know. And I'll regret that every day for the rest of my life. The cafe fell quiet around us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me for 3 years. So where did you go? Ryan looked out the window. I admitted myself to a mental health treatment center. I stared at him. For 6 months. I was diagnosed with severe depression, anxiety, and panic disorder. I couldn't even recognize the person I'd become. He smiled sadly. By the time I was healthy enough to face the world, my father had passed away. And I convinced myself you would never want to see me again. I couldn't stop the tears from falling. Not because everything had suddenly become okay. Because for the first time in 3 years, I finally understood that the man who left me at the altar hadn't walked away because he stopped loving me. He walked away because fear had become stronger than love. Ryan looked at me with eyes full of regret. I know I destroyed your life. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I needed you to know one thing. What? He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching my hand. There was never another woman. There was only a broken man who made the worst decision of his life. He took a slow, trembling breath. I've spent 3 years wishing I had chosen courage instead of fear. His voice cracked. And if there's even the smallest chance. He looked directly into my eyes. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prove that running away was the biggest mistake I ever made. Ryan's words lingered between us long after he stopped speaking. The coffee in front of us had gone cold. Neither of us had taken more than a few sips. Outside the cafe window, people hurried along the sidewalk, completely unaware that 2 lives were quietly standing at the edge of a decision that could never be undone. I looked at the letter still resting in my hands. The paper was worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. If he had given it to me 3 years earlier, everything might have been different. Maybe I would have stood beside him through his father's illness. Maybe we would have faced his panic attacks together. Maybe we would have postponed the wedding instead of destroying it. There were so many maybes. But life isn't built on maybes. It's built on the choices we actually make. I carefully folded the letter and slid it back across the table. You should keep this, I said softly. Ryan looked down at it. I don't deserve to. It reminds you of the truth. He nodded but didn't pick it up immediately. I'm sorry, he whispered again. I know those words can't erase what happened. They can't. I know. For a long moment, we simply looked at one another. Then I asked the question that had quietly formed in my mind. Why now? Ryan took a deep breath. I've wanted to come back for a long time. What stopped you? Shame. He gave a weak smile. Every day that passed made it harder. I kept telling myself I'd explain tomorrow. Then tomorrow became another month. Then another year. He looked out the window. My therapist finally asked me one question that changed everything. What was it? He asked whether I was avoiding your anger or avoiding my own guilt. I stayed silent. He was right. I wasn't afraid of what you'd say. I was afraid of seeing the pain I caused. He finally picked up the letter and slipped it back into his wallet. I've spent 3 years trying to become someone who would never run away again. I believed him. Not because he asked me to. Because the man sitting across from me was different from the one who disappeared on our wedding day. There was humility in his voice. honesty in his eyes. The arrogance I once associated with confidence had been replaced by quiet self-awareness. But even genuine change doesn't erase the past. Ryan looked at me carefully. I know I have no right to ask this. But is there any chance? He hesitated. That we could start over? The question hung in the air. 3 years ago, my answer would have come without hesitation. Yes. 1,000 times yes. But the woman sitting in that cafe wasn't the same woman who had walked toward the altar believing love alone could solve everything. 3 years had changed me. Pain had changed me. Healing had changed me. I smiled gently. Ryan. He immediately understood from the expression on my face. His shoulders dropped slightly. You already know. I think I do. I forgive you. His eyes filled with tears. You do? Yes. I carried anger for a long time. It became exhausting. Forgiving you wasn't something I did for you. I did it for myself. A tear rolled down his cheek. I don't deserve that. Maybe not. But forgiveness and trust are different things. He nodded slowly. I understand. I believe you loved me. I believe your father's illness broke you. I believe your fear was real. I even believe that leaving wasn't meant to hurt me. I paused. But it still did. He closed his eyes. I know. The hardest part isn't that you left. The hardest part is that when life became unbearable, you decided I couldn't stand beside you. He whispered, I was trying to protect you. I know. But real love doesn't protect people by shutting them out. It lets them choose whether they want to stay. He lowered his head. I stole that choice from you. Yes. You did. The silence between us wasn't filled with resentment anymore. It was filled with acceptance. Ryan looked at me one last time. So this is goodbye? I smiled sadly. No. This is closure. He laughed quietly through his tears. That sounds like something you'd say. I've had 3 years to think. So have I. We both stood from the table. As we walked outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to set. The golden light reflected across the windows of the buildings, making everything feel strangely peaceful. Ryan turned toward me. I'll always love you. I looked at him with kindness. And a part of me will always care about you. But caring about someone doesn't always mean you're meant to spend your life together. He nodded. I finally understand that. I hope one day you find happiness. I hope you do too. For a second, neither of us moved. Then Ryan opened his arms slightly. May I? I smiled. One last hug. I stepped forward. The embrace wasn't romantic. It wasn't the beginning of another love story. It was two people saying goodbye to the version of themselves that had once dreamed of forever. When we stepped apart, there were tears in both of our eyes. But there was also peace. Ryan placed one hand over his heart. Thank you for listening. Thank you for finally telling the truth. He nodded once before turning and walking away. This time, I watched him leave without feeling abandoned. Because he wasn't taking anything from me. He was simply walking toward a different future. And so was I. A week later, I returned to the lakeside where Ryan had proposed years earlier. The same quiet water stretched out before me. The same trees swayed gently in the wind. Everything looked familiar. Yet everything felt different. I reached into my bag and took out the engagement ring I had kept in a small velvet box. For years, I had held onto it because I couldn't let go of the life I thought I was supposed to have. Now I realized I didn't need it anymore. Not because those memories meant nothing. Because they had already taught me everything they were meant to teach. I smiled, closed the box one final time, and walked away with it still in my hands. Some memories aren't meant to be thrown away. They're meant to remind us how far we've come. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Lily. Dinner tonight? I found that little Italian restaurant you've been wanting to try. I smiled. Absolutely. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I started the engine and drove away from the lake without looking back. For years, I believed Ryan leaving me at the altar was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Now I understood something I never could have imagined on that heartbreaking wedding day. His decision didn't end my life. It redirected it. It forced me to discover strength I never knew I possessed. It taught me that love without trust cannot survive. It showed me that healing is not forgetting the past but refusing to let it control your future. Most importantly, it reminded me that the right person will never ask you to lose yourself in order to love them. Sometimes people don't come back to reclaim the future they lost. Sometimes they come back to give you the answers you needed so you can finally stop looking behind you. And as I drove toward the life I had built with my own hands, I realized the greatest love story I would ever experience wasn't the one that ended at the altar. It was the one that began the moment I learned to choose myself.